Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Julian Montgomery, and I decided to do a video illustrating why I switched from Pro Tools to Cubase. So I've been working with Pro Tools for probably 5 or 6 years now, and my first major DAW was Cubase, a much older version of Cubase. I'm not sure what the version number was at the time. Eventually, I switched to Logic Pro 9, and then I eventually switched to Pro Tools 10 HD. And I've been on Pro Tools all the way up through the recent release of 2018 HD. I also have Logic Pro X, and I've used that some. Recently, though, I decided to switch to Cubase Pro 9.5. I actually used a trial version of it for 2 weeks, and after 2 weeks I made the decision that I wanted to officially switch, and at this point it's been 3 weeks. So I am a composer, film composer, and I use a large template. I also use Vienna Ensemble Pro, and I use a piece of software called Composer Tools Pro made by MIDI Kinetics, and that runs on my iPad. I thought it was important to point out those three things because those are the major factors that played a role in me deciding to switch. So I'm going to go through what I perceive to be some of the advantages and disadvantages of each DAW. It's not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. It's just some of the things that were important to me. All right, so here we go. So in Pro Tools, I have this template, and you'll see here I just have a ton of tracks in here, and I think I had purchased a new library that I wanted to get set up in Vienna Ensemble Pro, and then create the MIDI tracks in Pro Tools to be able to use that library. So I came to Pro Tools here, and I wanted to start off by adding 2 new MIDI tracks. And when I hit create here, I got this message. This was basically telling me that I had reached the maximum number of MIDI tracks that Pro Tools allows. And that totally threw me off. So I went and pulled up the Pro Tools documentation. And sure enough, in their documentation, they tell you the maximum number of MIDI tracks that you can have, as well as instrument tracks and auxiliary tracks. I mean, there's a max, and it's 512. So my template must have gotten large enough to where I had 512 MIDI tracks, and it wouldn't let me exceed that. So I came up with a workaround, which was to add an instrument track. So what I have here is an instrument track, and I could take this track and assign it to my VE Pro ports. So let's just say this was my new instrument. I could assign it to this port and this MIDI channel, and then I could use this track as if it was just a MIDI track. So this opened the door to having, to still be able to add additional tracks to my session and use them like MIDI tracks. But I still had a 512 limit even on these kinds of tracks. And it felt to me like a workaround. It wasn't something that I wanted to really do. I wanted to just add a MIDI track. And so this is in essence what opened the door for me to say, is there a DAW that is better equipped to handle a large template with a ton of MIDI tracks? Cubase allows you to mix unlimited MIDI instrument and audio tracks. I have my template up here, and let me zoom in. Actually, let's do this. All right, there we go. And you'll see I have 766 tracks in my template right now. And if I just show the MIDI tracks, let me uncheck these. You'll see I have either 617 or 629 MIDI tracks. I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between these two numbers, but either way, you know, I have over 600 MIDI tracks in my template. And if I just bring over their documentation, you'll see it says in their documentation that you can record and mix unlimited audio, instrument, and MIDI tracks. That was important for me to see in their documentation, in writing, and then also to be able to prove that out by setting up my template with all the tracks that I currently need, and to make sure that it all, you know, will work in Cubase. The other thing that had become really annoying, and I had started noticing this, you know, way before I reached this 512 limit, was just that the more and more MIDI tracks that I added to my session, the greater impact it had on just how Pro Tools performed. And I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So right now, I'm going to take several of these tracks and I am going to remove them. So I'm going to delete these tracks. All right. And then I'm just going to add some tracks back. Oops, not instrument. We want MIDI tracks. Now you see how long it's starting to take to add them. And let me just start renaming these. Now I just renamed this track, but that name hasn't showed up yet. It will eventually. I'll just go through and rename these tracks. And then here's the last one here. And I'm still waiting for that name to show up. It tells me it's, you know, you'll see when I hover over it. Let me go here. Come on, Pro Tools. I mean, I'm still waiting for it to refresh here on the screen and show me the name of this track. There we go. I mean, it's showing me that it's track name is track 1, but I'm still waiting on this to reflect on the screen. It's okay. As you can see here now the name has showed up. I'll hide some tracks from the view here. And I'll bring them back. Nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, yeah, okay, that actually is what I want to do. So I'm just showing a few tracks. And while it's doing this, I can't really do anything until it really gets done basically doing the last step that I tried to have it do. And I actually did it by accident, but it was what it got to illustrate my point here. Now it's done. And then ultimately, closing out of a session now is going to take an extremely long time. You'll see this dialogue is going to eventually come up. It's still trying to do some things in Pro Tools, and this is just going to creep along closing the session. And this is basically, I was just living with this until I reached that 512 limit. And reaching that 512 limit, made me start to look elsewhere, but then it magnified the fact that the more tracks I was adding to my template, the slower Pro Tools seemed to become. Even with all of these tracks in Cubase, I don't see any degradation in performance. As you can see, I'm just kind of scrolling up and down, and it's fairly responsive. I can show and hide tracks. I'm just telling it to not show some tracks, and that's real responsive. I can tell it to show these tracks now that I had hid, and it all works fine. I can add some tracks, so let me go ahead and add a few instrument tracks, and they get added fine, and it's still responsive. It hasn't slowed down. I can move tracks around, and it's still responsive when I click on things. And I can delete tracks, and Cubase is still responsive when I click on things, or when I move things around. It hasn't shown any degradation in performance, and that was one of my important factors as to why I switched. With Composer Tools Pro, there is really good integration with Cubase as well as Logic. It allows you to implement this feature that recalls your setup in Composer Tools Pro based on the track that you select. So as you can see right now, it's on my Spitfire configuration because I have a track, Violins 1, that is my Spitfire symphonic strings. And if I switch to Violins 1 for Cinematic Studio Series, here you go. It's switched on my iPad. And if I switch to Violins 1 Longs for Berlin strings, it switched the screen on my iPad. So it allows you basically to switch tracks in your DAW. And as you switch tracks, the screens are switching in Composer Tools Pro, so you can just quickly start, switching articulations for that given instrument. It wasn't necessarily why I switched, but now that I have switched, it's a huge advantage. When I click on a track here in Pro Tools, it doesn't automatically switch to the preset that corresponds to that instrument. So what I have to do is I go to the instrument that I want here in Pro Tools, and then I have to go to my iPad and find the corresponding preset. So the way that Composer Tools Pro is set up, there's banks. Each bank has up to 16 presets. So I have to look through here and find the one that corresponds to Choir's Arcs for Lacrimosa. And here it goes. So then I can load that up. Now it's loaded up, and I can now switch articulations for this particular track. So, then I go to another track. Let's just say I want to go to, I don't know, let's say Violins 1 CSS. So this is Violins 1 from Cinematic Studio Strings. Then I got to go back to Composer Tools Pro and find the preset for that, Cinematic Studio Series, and now I can use it. So, I mean, I can use Composer Tools Pro fine with Pro Tools. It's just more manual. I did ask the people at MIDI Kinetics, are they going to implement the auto recall functionality similar to how it's implemented for Cubase and Logic? And I'll just show you here. This was a conversation, a quick email exchange I had with them. I asked them, are they planning on implementing this recall functionality for Pro Tools? And they said they've looked at it, it's on their list, but basically they don't have enough users, and so they're not going to invest the time into building a custom AAX plugin to make this possible. So basically, for now, if I was working in Pro Tools, I would just have to live with this, with manually recalling the presets, as opposed to in Cubase, it's automatic. Finding a track in Pro Tools is not nearly as powerful as it is in Cubase. So I can bring up this scroll to track functionality, and I can scroll to a track, start typing a name, and it'll give me a narrowed down list. I select a track and it'll scroll to it. Works great. However, let's say I know I want to look at some kind of a drum track. So I just type the word drum. If it doesn't start with those letters, it doesn't find it. So I have to make sure that my naming ensures that I can find a track. If I want to find percussion, it's only going to find tracks that have started with what I typed. So it's really just a starts with search. That's all it is. It's nice, to be able to have that ability, but that's all it is. In Cubase, finding tracks is just more powerful. And I'll just show you really quickly what I mean. So I come in here and let's just say I type drum. You'll see it pulled up any track name that has the letters DRUM in it. It doesn't have to just start with drum. As long as there is drum in the name, it comes up. As well, if it's in a folder and that folder has drum in it, it comes up. So because I search for drums or for drum, and I have cinematic hits in my Epic Drums and Hits folder, cinematic hits comes up in my search results. So finding tracks is just powerful. It'll search through any part of the track name as well as the folder in which the tracks are contained. Simply put, Cubase has folders and Pro Tools doesn't. This is something that we have been begging for in Pro Tools for years, and for some reason they just have not added folders. And I don't know, maybe it's just because I have an IT background, but I need folders. It really helps to just organize my session. And so you'll see in Cubase here, I have, all kinds of folders for all the different types of instruments. And for me, it's such a great organizational tool that I just never had in Pro Tools. And I wanted for a long time, but it just never showed up. And now that I've switched to Cubase, I have folders. So you'll see in this template, I mean, I have tons of tracks. I have them color coded, to help me kind of differentiate a set of tracks from another set. And Pro Tools does offer the ability to find a track, but it just doesn't offer this ability to create folders. And Cubase does. And that's a big reason why, if I'm going to switch to Cubase, or at least going to entertain it, it's going to grab me. Cubase has this great feature that allows you to show just the tracks with data on them. So I have Command Option D mapped to that command. So if I hit those keys, well, actually, let me back up. As you'll see, I'm showing all of the tracks that I have in this session. If I kind of show here, everything is checked, right? So now I'm going to hit Command Option D, and you'll see now I'm just showing the tracks that have data on them. And you'll see kind of in this visibility view what those tracks are. If I want to switch back, I have another key command mapped to showing all the tracks, Command Option A. I hit those keys. Now I'm back showing all the tracks. That's a great feature in Cubase that just isn't available in Pro Tools. Cubase easily allows you to show a different set of tracks in the project edit window versus the mix console. So you'll see in my edit window right now, I'm showing all the tracks. Everything is checked. And if I switch over to my mix console, you'll see here I'm just showing a certain set of tracks, just only the tracks that are important from a mixing standpoint. Whereas in my project window, I'm showing all the tracks that I'll need, as I'm composing and recording all of the MIDI data. I mean, it's possible in Pro Tools, but you can only do it through this concept of Windows configurations. And so you'll have to switch between window configurations, which basically, if you can't really change the tracks, and have them different in your edit window versus your mix console, you can just set up a whole different window configuration that is just displaying a different set of tracks. And it becomes a little problematic if you start adding tracks to your session after your window configurations are set up. I'll just say, to me, they're a little cumbersome. So I used them for a while, but I just started noticing as I was adding tracks or removing tracks, my configurations weren't reacting properly. So I just stopped using them. Maybe they're better in the latest version of Pro Tools, but in Cubase, it's easy. You just tell it which tracks you want to display in one window versus the other. Cubase has this concept of generic remotes that allow you to generically map an external device, if you will, to be able to control Cubase. So Pro Tools also, has the ability to allow control surfaces to control Pro Tools. I mean, that's used worldwide. But what's different about Cubase is that these are generic remotes. So these aren't anything that Cubase is built to know about. You can just configure them to basically execute just about any command that Cubase allows, and then this external device can generically interact with Cubase. So I have a generic remote set up here that allows me to do a few things in Cubase. And I'm sure over time this is going to grow. You know, I'm new to Cubase really, so I've only set up 4 of these. And so basically, with this generic remote, I'm going to bring in my iPad. And so with Composer Tools Pro, I have some utilities set up. I already showed previously how you can show only tracks with data or show all tracks. But now I can actually do this with a press of a button in Composer Tools Pro. So right now I'm showing all the tracks in this particular session. So if I just click show only tracks with data, now I'm showing just tracks with data. And then if I go back and press show all tracks, now I'm showing all tracks. So I could do that with a key command, but I can also now map some of the buttons here in Composer Tools Pro to do the same thing. Cubase has this great feature called expression maps. And you'll hear people who love Cubase rave about this concept called expression maps. Basically, it's just a way of being able to map different keys. For example, if you had key switches, be able to map those to expressions, and then you can see those expressions in your key editor. I have, I'll just show a quick example. I have a library from Spitfire called, I'm going to get this guy's name wrong, Olafur Arnaud's Chamber Evolutions. It's a beautiful library, string library, and it has some kind of synthy things as well. So I have an expression map set up, and I'll just quickly show you that expression map. So basically, different key switches here will map to different articulations that are available in this particular library. So I'm going to just draw in a quick line here so we can see some things in the editor. And let me click on that. Make this a little bigger. So if I zoom in here a little bit, you'll see in the editor now I have these articulations showing up. So I could say, all right, we're going to do the longest one there, and then here we'll do the shortest. Then we'll switch to tremolo, short here, and then back to longest here. So now you can literally see here in the editor the articulations that I'm using at different points. It's kind of a cool feature. I've only got a couple of these set up right now. Over time, I'm going to be setting up more and more of these. It's nice to be able to see the articulations in this window. And I can, I trigger my articulations from Composer Tools Pro, but I can also just draw them in here real easily. It's just, it's a nice feature that is pretty much exclusive to Cubase. I'm sure this is going to probably seem a little trivial, but Cubase has the ability to capture notes at the project level. And I don't know why Pro Tools just doesn't allow you to capture notes at the project level. They both allow you to capture comments at the track level, so each track can have some comments. But I really like to be able to write some things down about this entire session. And I used to be able to do that in Logic when I was on Logic Pro 9, and it's available in Logic Pro X as well. But Pro Tools, when I switched to Pro Tools, I lost the ability to capture those notes. So I was relegated to opening up a text editor and writing some things down and then storing that in the same folder as my session. But now that I'm back to using Cubase, I can now capture these notes right in my DAW. And that to me is just a great thing. Cubase allows you to have multiple projects open at once. It's something that I've wanted for a long time in Pro Tools, but it just hasn't been available. So I've already opened up 2 projects here because I have so many tracks and they're having to connect over to Vienna Ensemble Pro. It takes a little while to load up a project. So I didn't want to bear you guys, with that load time. So I already have the projects open. So here I have my session template builder project, and then I can switch over here to another project that I call L10 Action. Now, you can only have one active project, so only one project activated project. So only one project can be your activated project. So it'll be the project that you can actually interact with, but you can have the projects open. So the reason why I thought this was a big deal is there's many times where, I worked on a previous song, and now I'm working on a song, 6 months later, and I remember this kick that I use on this other song that I want to use. I think it'll work well in this song. And, I could go over to, or maybe there was just something about it, some way that I EQ'd it, or, some effect that I added onto it. I just can't remember what it is. I just want to open up the project and take a look real quick. In Pro Tools, I would have had to close the project I was in, open up the other project, take a look at it, what I would do is I would do screen captures or write some things down, because then I would have to close out of that project and then open up the project that I'm actually working on. And, that's just cumbersome. It's time consuming. So if I needed to here, I could just switch over to this other project, and take a look at a track here and see how I did something, or, just grab some information off of a track, and then I can just go back over to the track that I'm working on, and it's all right there. So it's just a nice, convenient thing to be able to have multiple tracks open at once. It's not something that I use a lot, but it is, whenever I want to reference something that I did on a previous song, it comes in handy. In Cubase, one of the annoying things is you can only add one type of track at a time. So when I go here to add a track, I can only add one of these types of tracks. And I can add multiple of those types of tracks. I mean, I can add, more than one instrument track, but I can only add, in this case, instrument tracks. So if I wanted to add, some instrument tracks, some group tracks, some VCA faders, I basically have to, add the instrument tracks, and then come back here, add the group tracks that I want, and then, come back and add the next type of track that I want. Maybe it's an audio track. I want 2 of those. That's just, Cubase needs to change that. They need to be able to allow you to add multiple types of tracks at once. Adding multiple track types in Pro Tools is easy. So I can bring up the add track dialog. I can add an audio track, 5 stereo audio tracks. I'm going to add 1 mono audio track, 5 stereo audio tracks, 3 uh, instrument tracks. I can do this all at once and then create those. And here they are. There's some aspects to the metering in Pro Tools that are better than Cubase. And I'll just point out a couple things. So one is Pro Tools has a bunch of different algorithms that you can choose from, depending on what you're doing. Now, I am not an expert on metering, so I don't even know what the difference is between a lot of these, but it's available. And then the other thing is that you'll see this little, I don't know, this little bar here, and this is where it shows the gain reduction that's happening on your track. And you have different things that you can choose from. So while you're mixing, you can not only see, you know, the metering here, but you can also see with the, you know, in my case, I have it set to, what is that again? Compressor limiter. So I can get a sense of the amount of compression that is happening on my track as I'm looking at the levels. And this is always, you know, once this got introduced, I want to say it was Pro Tools 11. I might be wrong about that. But this to me was great. So I can see on each one of my tracks the effect that the compression and limiting was having. The metering in Cubase is just not as advanced as Pro Tools. I mean, you do have, you know, some settings. You know, you can change whether you want your meter to be input, post fader, or post panner. You can choose some options, you know, a couple little global options here. You know, and there's some preferences that you can set. You know, some pretty basic things related to metering, but I would say it's fairly simplistic compared to Pro Tools. Pro Tools is just much more advanced. The visibility that Cubase gives you into your system performance, I think, is embarrassing. This is all you get. I mean, they're not even putting percentages up here. You know, so you can kind of tell your average load, and you know, you can get some peak information and kind of some information about your disk cache. You can't tell how the load is being spread around your CPU. I mean, I don't know. This is, to me, it's just pretty embarrassing. And so this is basically it. The visibility that Pro Tools gives you into system performance is just much better. I'll bring up this system usage window, and I can see kind of a total CPU usage. I can see how it's being spread across all of my virtual cores. I can see how much memory is being used, disk cache, how much is actually being retrieved from the disk. And this voice allocated, that's a whole topic unto itself. That's actually kind of an annoying thing about Pro Tools, is this whole concept of voices allocated. But anyways, I can see a lot more about how this particular session is, what impact it's having on my system. Cubase, you know, allows you to insert effects, or, you know, route to send effects. However, the default, it comes with only one default view, and that's basically a view of the inserts by category. So what I mean by that is here it is. Here's the default view here. And, you know, they're just kind of broken down into different categories. So what it's missing, in my opinion, is to also be able to show your available plugins by vendor. So what I had to do was go into the plugin manager, and I created a new collection by vendor. Okay, and I just told to take all of the plugins. You know, in the world of Cubase, everybody uses the term VST. So, you know, take all my VSTs and basically create this collection by vendor. So now then, when I go here to do an insert, I can show them by vendor, or I can show the default view. The problem with that so far, and again, I'm a new Cubase user, so maybe there's a way to do this better. But when I add a new VST, it doesn't show up in this collection. So example of what I'm talking about is this Abbey Road vinyl from Waves. I just purchased that, and it shows up in my by my default view here. If I look under modulation, there it is. But then when I go to the collection that I set up manually, and I look under waves and look under modulation, it's not there. So what that means then is every time I add a new plugin, I gotta go and rebuild this collection. Now maybe someone will see this and they'll provide some comments as to how I can set this up where I don't have to manage this collection myself. But as of now, that's what it looks like to me, and I am definitely not loving that at all. Pro Tools will show you the inserts, or I should say the plugins that you want to insert onto a track, either by category or by manufacturer or by both. It's a preference that you set up in Pro Tools, and I have mine set up to show both by category and manufacturer. So if I go to insert a plugin here, the top is category and the bottom is manufacturer. So there isn't anything that I had to do to create this listing by manufacturer. I just had to check an option to say, show them to me like this. And if I add a new plugin, so I just added the Abbey Road vinyl plugin recently, it automatically shows up in the manufacturer list as well as in the category list. So in that regard, I would call this a clear advantage. I guess one of the disadvantages is you can't create your own custom collection of plugins in Pro Tools. You basically only get by category or by manufacturer or by both. Pro Tools has this great ability to automate the volume trim on a track. So basically I can go to a track here and select volume trim. And you'll see the volume trim is a yellow line, and your volume is this blue line. So I can automate this and you'll see the effect that it has on your volume. So I'm going to trim the volume some. But because it's volume trim and not volume, I can still use the fader. So I'll pull up the mix window. And what track was that? That was Chamber Waves, or what? Chamber Evo Episodic. So here's my Chamber Evo Episodic. I can still use my fader, even though I have some volume trim automation. So I'll play this, and you'll see the fader on this change as it's playing. And that's what you want. But I want to be able to, let's say I want to raise this up a little bit. I can do that. I can change the fader, and then the volume trim will just have a relative effect on wherever my fader is. Cubase has trim automation, and it works quite well, but it doesn't have the same kind of volume trim automation that's available in Pro Tools. So if you wanted to try to simulate that or emulate that in Cubase, as far as I can tell, there's one of two options that you could try. So you could take a track here. I have my violins 1, and let's say I want to try to simulate volume trim. I would assign this to a link group and create a new VCA fader. So now I have violins 1 and link group 1, and I have this VCA fader. And then I could automate that VCA fader, and I'm just going to switch over here to the edit window here, and I'll just draw in some automation. Okay, so I've automated the VCA fader. So if I were to play this, you'll see the VCA fader will change, and it affects my violins 1 track. But I can still independently move this fader here on violins 1. So let's say I set it here, and now I play it again. Now it's going to work like volume trim. It's adjusting the gain on, or the volume on this violins 1 relative. So, but I still have control of the volume here. So it's not actually automating the volume on violins 1. It's just relatively making adjustments to the volume based on wherever your volume is set. And that's was one of the beauties of using volume trim in Pro Tools. Another way that you could do this is, let me actually undo all of this. So another way that you could do this is you could take the inserts here and insert a post fader in, maybe a compressor, and just have it not compress. Here, I'll just put something on here. I don't know, where am I gonna, okay, we'll try this. And just use it for gain. So, don't do any compression. Just use it for gain, and then automate the gain on this compressor. So I could come here now, and let's see, let me automate my compressor here. And maybe I want to automate the output level. Let me just expand this. And I'll do the same thing. I'll just draw in some automation. So, you know, this is clearly a workaround, but by doing this post fader, I'll press play here. You'll see the actually, let me start this over and zoom in here. You'll see that the output is changing. I'll run this again. So the output levels are changing here, but I could still control the fader here, right? So again, it would still do more of a level or a relative output based on where this fader is set. You know, these are both workarounds. The VCA fader approach is probably the cleaner way of doing this, but you know, they will both kind of work. But what I really want in Cubase is just the ability to automate volume trim and still have this still have access to my fader. So if I want to make changes, I can just move my fader and set that to a different point, and then all of my volume trim would just be relative to where my fader is. Grouping tracks in Pro Tools is just a far better implementation than Cubase. In fact, because I've been exposed to grouping tracks in Pro Tools, now that I've switched to Cubase, outside of a few scenarios, I don't really see myself using link groups too much in Cubase. Link groups are what are synonymous with groups in Pro Tools. Link groups is the Cubase term. So let me just show you one or two small things here. So I'm going to take these tracks and I'm going to create a group. I'll just call it group 1, and we're just going to focus on the fact that this group can affect the volume and the mute. You can ignore these two down here. I'm not going to focus on them for this exercise. So I have group 1, and I can adjust the fader for all 3 tracks in the group, and I can mute all 3 tracks. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another group that's going to include the same 3 tracks plus some additional tracks. And this is something, first of all, I can't have 2 different groups that share tracks in Cubase. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this one up to only be able to mute the track, so it doesn't do volume. So I've got group 1 and group 2. Again, group 1, if I have that one selected, it controls the volume for these 3 tracks, and I can mute. And if I have group 2 selected, I can mute all of these tracks that are in that group, but if I go to the fader for one of these, it only will adjust the fader for that one track because this group doesn't, volume is not included in this group. If I have both of these groups selected, then if I mute, sorry, clicked the wrong track. If I click mute, all tracks will be muted. If I try to adjust the volume on one of these tracks that is not in the first group, it still just does the fader for that one track. But because I have 1 and 2 selected, if I try to adjust the volume here, then it will adjust the volume for all 3 of the tracks that are in the first group. So it's smart enough to know when you go and change something on a track, if a group is selected and other tracks in that group can be affected by that modifier, then it will adjust it on all the tracks in that group, even when multiple groups are selected. So in Cubase, you can't have a track in multiple groups, and thus it's not smart enough to be able to do what I just showed you. Cubase has the concept of link groups, which again are synonymous with groups in Pro Tools. And they're pretty easy to set up. You can just select the tracks you want to group, click link here, and give it a name, and you have a link group. So now these two, the tracks are linked together. You can create another link group. Select some other tracks, click link, give it a name, and now you have a link group. And these tracks are linked. But in Cubase, one of the differences is that a track can only belong to one link group at a time. So let's say I wanted to create another link group that included the first two tracks from link group 1 and 2 additional tracks. Cubase is going to force me to unlink the first two, and then I can create the link group. So it doesn't have the concept of, basically in Pro Tools, I could have a single track belong to multiple groups, and it's smart enough to know which faders to move up and down, or what knobs to, whether you're linking panning or soloing or muting. It knows which tracks to be affected based on the groups that are selected. One of the advantages that Cubase has is you can create temporary link groups. So I could take these two tracks here, and on the Mac, hold Shift and Option, which you'll see Q-Link is now highlighted, and now these two are linked temporarily. As soon as I let go of Shift and Option, now they're no longer linked. So, it works okay, but Pro Tools is just more advanced. It's a better implementation. And because a track can only belong to one link group, I personally am really not sure how much I will use it. Cubase has the ability to freeze tracks. And in fact, it had this ability long before Pro Tools did. And I used to hear when Pro Tools first allowed you to freeze tracks, I would hear from people who use other DAWs, oh, well, we've already been able to do that a long time. However, one thing I have discovered is that Cubase's freeze track implementation is inferior to Pro Tools. So in Cubase, you can come here. So I have this track, low bass, selected. You can come here and freeze an instrument. And your options are to freeze the instrument only, or to freeze the instrument and the channel. So basically all of the inserts that are on this channel. So what you don't have is the ability to select up to which insert do you want to freeze. So it's either instrument or all inserts. Those are your only two options. And the other thing is that you have to select the tail size. So, if you have something that maybe it's a kind of a reverb, or you just want to allow that particular channel to kind of go through its cycle, you set the tail size. So you could mistakenly cut it off. Whereas in Pro Tools, it will just capture that tail no matter how long it is. In Cubase, maybe it's good that you have an option, but to me, it leaves it open for error. So, those are really your two options. And then the other thing about freezing tracks that is inferior is you can only freeze one track at a time. I can't select these two tracks and press any combination of keys along with this freeze button and have it freeze all of the tracks that I have selected. In fact, it's something, if you go onto the Cubase forums, it's a request in the forum to be able to do this. So, if I have several tracks in my session that I need to freeze to unload some CPU, I've got to go through these tracks one at a time, which is just not a good use of time. So, yeah, while it's had freezing tracks longer than longer than Pro Tools, the implementation is inferior. Freezing tracks in Pro Tools is just a better implementation. Pro Tools was definitely not first out of the gate with this ability, but at least comparing it between Pro Tools and Cubase, it's just a better implementation. So you can either, select a track and freeze it, and that will freeze the entire track. You can decide up to which insert do I want to freeze. So you go up to an insert in that track and you say, freeze up to this insert. You can also freeze multiple tracks. So I could select these, and I'm on a Mac, I'm holding Shift and Option. And then if I go to freeze, it'll freeze all three of them. Or I could hold down Shift and Option and say, freeze up to this insert. And I'll just do that. And it'll go through and it'll freeze all three of the tracks I have selected, and it'll freeze up to that second insert. So you'll see here, I have 3 frozen tracks, frozen up to the second insert, and the third insert, I can pull up that insert and I can manipulate it. Just an overall better implementation. Pro Tools has an audio suite plugin that comes with Pro Tools that allows you to kind of create that tape stop effect as well as the tape start effect. So you just have to select the region that you want to affect, go into Audio Suite, pitch shift, and find the Verify plugin. It kind of comes preset to do a slowdown, so I'll just render that as a slowdown, and then I'll just take this and do a speed up and render that. And now I've just created the tape start and tape stop. I don't have my system wired up so you can hear this while I'm doing a screen share, so you just have to kind of trust me on that. The biggest reason why I'm showing you this is that Cubase doesn't come with anything that really allows you to do both tape start and tape stop. Logic has I think is the best way of doing it. It has a very intuitive, I'll say intuitive, but it actually is a little hard to find at first, but it's a way of basically doing fades, fade in and fade outs, and you can do them as tape stops and tape starts. It's really easy. So both Pro Tools and Logic have this. I'm sure other DAWs do too. Cubase just doesn't. Cubase has a nice little app that you can install on your iPad to remote control Cubase. And it's, it's a fairly straightforward, fairly basic application. You see I have it on the screen here. This is from my iPad. And, you can control a fader. So I'll bring your attention down here to this track here, chamber waves long. I'm going to control that fader on my iPad. You can adjust the panning. Yeah, so you can adjust the panning. You can mute, solo. There's several things that you can do. You can also go to markers. So you'll see right now the cursor is over here at marker 1. Go to marker 2, marker 3. It's handy stuff. You can play, you can record. There's a few little different views here. that give you access to some of the functionality in Cubase, and there's a lot of different things that you can do. It's a nice little app. The biggest issue to me is that it costs $17, unlike Pro Tools, which is free. Pro Tools has the Control iPad app, and that one is free. It's a little, I would say the Pro Tools one is a little more cumbersome to set up, but once it's set up, it works well, and it's free. Why is Cubase charging $17 for this? It works well though. So I use it all the time, and when I want to kind of step back from a mix and hear it from a distance and just kind of make some tweaks, I keep the iPad in my hand and I can make some adjustments to my mix. All right, so that's it. Now you know why I switched from Pro Tools to Cubase, and you know what I perceive to be some of the advantages and disadvantages of both DAWs. I'll have to admit, even though I have switched to Cubase, it's more like switching to it as my primary DAW. I'm still going to use Pro Tools. Pro Tools, honestly, overall, is still my favorite DAW. If I could use unlimited MIDI tracks, and if I didn't notice any degradation in the overall performance of Pro Tools, I would not have even considered switching. But those were big enough factors to make me look elsewhere, and ultimately to cause me to switch over to Cubase. I'll say one of the potential advantages, I don't know for sure, but Cubase seems to be one of the most common DAWs used by composers, along with Logic Pro X. So, maybe there might be some benefit down the line as I collaborate with others that I'm using Cubase. But I still plan on using Pro Tools. Cubase, for example, you can't export video right now. So I'll still use Pro Tools to combine video and audio when I'm creating cues. And I don't know this for sure yet, but I am guessing that Pro Tools still has is better at recording with zero latency. So I'm expecting to, when I need to record vocals or if I'm sampling instruments, that I will do that with Pro Tools versus Cubase. But yeah, I'm on Cubase now as my primary DAW for doing MIDI, and so far so good.